So, on our computer systems, we are typically, anybody to use the system has to first identify themselves and authenticate themselves. And based on this authentication, certain rights are granted to them. So, for instance, if you log in as then you get identified to the system using your user ID or login name, and you have certain access rights, such as you can access certain documents, you can run certain programs and things like that. Okay, so what we are going to talk about today is how do you do this authentication, because obviously we are people, and computers don't necessarily understand or verify who we are directly. So the verification or authentication has to take place indirectly, typically using passwords. And so much of what we will talk about today is going to be based on passwords, but there could be there are alternatives to passwords, which we'll also cover. So so let's see how this is where we have come from the early days, right? So the passwords were pretty much the first mechanisms invented to for authentication, and they have been in place since the 50s and 60s. Okay, so in the very early days, the what was done was the passwords were generally stored in files, and the idea was that these files will be highly protected, and so normal users wouldn't be able to access these files. Again, keep in mind that until the last 20 or so years, typically the systems were multi-user systems. So there was an administrator and normal users, and the administrator will have access to many things, including maybe the password file, but normal users will not be able to access many of these, especially the password file. And so in the early days, what people, the users who wanted to show off, they will always try to break into this, or rather find a way to read the password file, and then, okay, once they have the password file, they know what the administrative password is, and then they can log into the system. So this was sort of a cat and mouse game in the 1960s. Each time the system developers would find a better way to protect the password file, and then the hackers would go ahead and show that they can still break in. And this kept happening, and so by the time Unix was designed in the 1970s, the Unix designers decided that this is just something that simply cannot be done. And so what they decided to do was not to store passwords at all. And that was the first time people decided that the actual passwords themselves will not be stored in any place, but a hash of these passwords will be created, and that will be stored in a file. And so the idea is that these hashes, if you recall reading about hashing in the Cryptographic Foundation's lecture, you will realize that hashing is one way. So given the hash, nobody can figure out what is the password, okay? But at the same time, the hash functions, these are cryptographic hash functions, they have this collision resistance property, which means that if somebody doesn't know the password, they will not be able to create another piece of text that will hash into the same hash value, right? So you have password, and what the system does is you type in your password in plain text, and the system hashes it and then checks whether it matches what is stored in the password database. So if an attacker comes in and they type in some other password, then they wouldn't be able to produce this. When that particular guest password is hashed, then chances are that it will produce something else, and therefore there won't be a match. And that's how password checking is done. So now if the password file is stolen, there is essentially nothing is lost, because knowing just the hashes, an attacker will not be able to figure out what is the original value that will produce the hash. Okay, because essentially that hash is not reversible. So the only way to find what is the original password is essentially to enumerate every possible password and then hash it and then see if it matches the value that's found in the password database. So so again, summarizing what I said so far, in the early days, people tried to protect the confidentiality of stored passwords, and this proved to be an impossible problem to solve for a variety of reasons. One of them is, well, things could be accidentally disclosed, and there could be accidental misconfiguration. For instance, somebody might incorrectly set the permissions on the password file, or there may be motivated attacks, especially if this is a high-value target. The system staff who have administrative access may make illegal copies for themselves, maybe in case something happens and they want to get in and they forget the password or something like that. Or there are overlooked ways to get at the password, which, for instance, the entire file system may be backed up, and when it is backed up, so when the entire system is backed up onto your tape, then anybody can read this tape and figure out what is the content of the password file, right? Because the permissions that you set on your files are enforced by the operating system. And so if you create a backup, then the backup is on a tape or some other type of media, and anybody that can steal the media can in fact mount it on their own machine, and then they can read anything that is on the tape. So there are overlooked ways through which the information may be revealed, and therefore trying to protect the confidentiality of stored passwords is really a bad idea. And so the idea that's currently prevalent is that you only store these hashes, are specifically the particular hash that was used originally in Unix uses this old encryption algorithm called DES, so the idea was that to apply this encryption algorithm on the password, the plain text password that the user types in, and so you just are going to apply this this encryption algorithm on this plain text password, and you're going to use the password itself as the encryption key. Okay, so both the input and the key are the user provided password. Okay, and more recently other algorithms have been used. So so let me restart. So now that the plain text passwords are no longer available, attackers start with these
hashed passwords. And if they can get access to these hashed passwords, then they can uh, carry out what are called offline attacks. These are attacks where the attacker is not trying to directly authenticate themselves to the system, but instead they are going to use some password cracking algorithm that can be run offline using these hashed passwords. And then after this cracking algorithm terminates, maybe they'll have the passwords and then they can try to authenticate themselves. The second approach is called online attack. In online attacks, there is no access to hashed passwords, so the attacker has to simply go to the password dialog and then type in their password, and they have to try it a few times until they get it right. And of course, online attacks are a little bit more difficult because no system will allow you to try your password thousands or millions of times. Whereas if you're using a password cracking tool and you're running that tool offline, then you can try it as many times as you want, and there's really no limit on how many times you can try this. So we will talk about online attacks later on. So we'll first focus on offline attacks because that's where the attacks are particularly easy. Okay, so in the password attacks, offline attacks, there are two basic types of attack. One is called brute force attack, where it's the attacker simply tries every possible password, and the problem is that, well, the number of such password combinations is very large, and so it's not a practical alternative unless the password length is very short. Then the second approach is called a dictionary attack. So the dictionary doesn't mean that a particular language dictionary. What it means is that there is some way of enumerating likely passwords, and then using this enumeration, you're going to try those passwords in that enumeration one by one, and that's how it's going to be done. So before we understand how easy either brute force or dictionary-based attacks is, we should have some idea of how do people choose passwords. And even in the 70s, people had this idea that most users are not careful about passwords. And so, in this very famous paper from the 1979, Morris and Thompson studied a collection of 3,300 passwords, and they found that some users used a single word password, and but lots of people ended up using 2 or 3 character passwords, and the people who used longer passwords were not the majority. So if you went to 6 letters or more, that's a fairly small number. So if you tried, if you looked at the type of passwords, all uppercase or all lowercase, then you can see that those types of passwords can be very easily enumerated. And so it turns out that quite a large fraction of these password space can be easily enumerated, and you can just try in an offline attack. The attacker simply enumerates the passwords and then checks whether any of them are whether any of the tried passwords match the hash in the password file, and if they do, well, now they know that they have found a password. So is everyone able to unmute themselves if they want to ask a question. Hello?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, so if someone is not able to unmute themselves when they have a question, let me know. And also when you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. As soon as I hear you, I'll stop and then listen to your question. And we'll see how it goes. If it becomes difficult, then I will come up with an alternative mechanism, such as raising your hand and stuff like that. Okay. So this was how it was in the 1970s, and you can imagine that in the 70s, people didn't think too much about security. So let's see how it is in recent times. So this is from a password leak that happened like 6 or 7 years ago. And after that leak, somebody went and analyzed the passwords. And in some cases, the people, the websites didn't even store hashed passwords. They ended up storing plain text passwords. And so it becomes very easy to analyze, how long are they, and are they all lowercase, uppercase, and so on. And this chart shows you that once again, passwords are no longer 1 or 2 characters, most probably because in the 2000s, no system would allow passwords that are perhaps shorter than 4 characters. But then you can see that most people choose 6, 7, or 8 characters, which is not particularly secure. And if you look further at number, the distribution of characters in these passwords, you can see that often you have either uppercase only or lowercase only, and so on. And so it becomes fairly easy to brute force this password space. Another common problem is that a password is reused across different sites, which means that if for any reason one of these sites suffers a breach and the password file is leaked, then an attacker will be able to figure out passwords that they can then use on another site. Okay, so this is why you are told these days, never use the same password on multiple sites, because we have come to expect that these password breaches will take place at a constant rate. And so the passwords are going to be leaked one way or the other. And so make sure that if one site suffers an outage, then that doesn't allow the attacker to get access to other accounts. So so these charts give you more interesting information, but I don't need to go through all of them here. So now again, for the most part, websites also store hashed passwords. So revealing the password, if the attacker is able to steal the password database, that still doesn't allow them to immediately figure out what the passwords are. They still need to use either a brute force attack or a dictionary attack in order to figure out what the real passwords are. And this is where the breaches, such as the one that happened early on, where the breaches involve plain text passwords, really helps, because these lists of plain text passwords becomes a dictionary that the attacker can choose when they try out different passwords, right? So they are going to say, hey, these are the passwords that I've seen people use in various places. Let me try, because chances are that some of the commonly used passwords are going to be commonly used everywhere. So there are a couple of factors, a couple of things that are done in order to make these brute force attacks difficult, and especially on this sort of a big database. And the way that is done is, in addition to hashing just the password, an additional quantity is added that's called a salt. Okay, so a salt is something that can be a random number, right? So what the way you can think of a salt working is that each user, when they sign up for an account, a random number is generated called the salt for this particular user. This salt value will also be stored in the password database. So what happens is that when the user types in their password, then the system concatenates the user specific salt value to the password, and then the whole thing is hashed. Okay, so the reason why this is useful is because the attacker now has to perform a hashing once on behalf of each user. Okay, so it's no longer enough to just hash the password, and then you cannot compare it with the password of everybody in the database, right? Because each user on the database has a different salt value. So the hash function being applied is going to be actually different for different users, because you're going to take their salt and combine the salt with the user password before you do the hash. So because of this, the attacker has to repeat the work once for each user. Okay, so so this makes offline attack more difficult, but still, what attackers have found is that they can use modern hardware to speed up these searches. So the chart here shows you how GPUs, GPU standing for graphical processing units. So the GPUs are now included in most machines. And then you can also buy clusters of GPUs, which have a large number of GPUs. And using these, you can perform hashing very fast. And so if you try, so this is, I believe, MD5. This chart shows you for different hashing algorithms how much text can be hashed per second. So you can see that there is a NTLM hashing algorithm, which is the one that's used for Windows domains, and GPUs. This is data from again 8 years ago, right? So things have become significantly faster. So maybe an order of magnitude faster, if not even more. So you can see that hundreds of gigabytes of data can be hashed in just a second using GPUs. So if you use MD5, well, it's not that much. You can go slightly, it takes slightly longer. The point is that if you have this kind of ability, then you can cycle through millions or even billions of passwords in a relatively short amount of time. And you can basically try out like a billion passwords in a matter of seconds, and then which means that these attacks can really be very successful. So over time, you know, people have changed the hashing algorithm that is used. So there are a few more modern algorithms like MD5 crypt, where these GPUs can do only millions, not billions of operations per second. And there are even faster, rather even slower hash algorithms, which for which only thousands of operations are possible. So you know, when these types of hashes are used, then dictionary attacks become much harder, unless the attacker can, you know, guess passwords with you know, very quickly. Like for instance, if somebody happens to use you know, 1234 as their password, you can imagine that you know, the attacker would in the first thing that the attacker would try is such passwords that are very often used by many users, and you know, they will get to that you know, very quickly. So so I would like more of you to turn on your camera, because otherwise I can't see. There is you know, almost no feedback. I can keep talking, and you know, I can also you know, even if I stop talking, I won't know whether there will be any response. So please keep your cameras on. Okay, so to make these attacks harder, you know, systems are using these slower hashing techniques, right? So that's what this slide summarizes. So if you make the hash algorithm slower, then it takes a longer time for attackers to try out, you know, various, you know, many passwords. Okay, and we already talked about salt. Okay, and again, keep in mind that the salt value is stored in the password database, but the salt value is different for different users, which means that if you want to check whether Alice has the password 1234, then you have to take Alice's salt and combine with that with 1234, hash the whole thing and check. And then if you want to check if Bob has the password 1234, then you have to repeat the operation all over, because Bob's salt is going to be different from Alice's salt. Okay, so this is how you make the attack slower. I will be handing out a homework problem set on this lecture and the crypto lecture later on, probably later this week. And one of the problems will get at this question of, you know, how exactly salt helps. So so one way to slow down the offline attacks is to make the hashing algorithm slower and using salt. The other way is, of course, you know, if you protect the password file, then these offline attacks becomes hard, right? So it used to be the case until you know, sometime in the 90s, the password file on Unix, the password file is called the etc password, right? So so etc password is the password file, and this used to be well readable because it only contains hashed passwords. So the thinking in those days was, well, stealing that doesn't help. But once these types of offline attacks became feasible, then attackers would obviously, you know, try to steal this and then crack the password. And so the modern Unix versions make the password file, you know, they break the password file into two parts. The public information continues to be in the etc password file, and the private information, which is basically the hashed password, that is stored in the etc shadow file. Okay, so now this etc shadow file is only readable by the administrator or the root, and therefore, unless you have root access, you cannot carry out password creep or offline attack. So now the second attack avenue is online attack. An online attack still is feasible, right? So how do you prevent online attacks? So one way to prevent online attacks is to build in mechanisms within the password dialog to prevent too many attempts, right? Because if the attacker is trying to guess, chances are that they will have to try many times before they are able to get the password. And so the authentication dialog can basically log the user out after a certain number of attempts, or or maybe introduce delays. Another possibility is to present the users with captchas, which make sure that at least it's not some automated system that's trying to guess passwords, because if it's an automated system, it can try many, many times. It's not going to get tired. So captchas are helpful there. So, so these are some ways to make online attacks difficult. And once you make it difficult enough, then the attacker will no longer try to do guessing. They will try to steal the password. Okay, so then we have to sort of think about, okay, so they are not trying to do offline attack using brute forcing or dictionary. They are not trying online attack because we have made that difficult. But then they have to then think about where will the attacker look next. So they can try to steal the password as you type it in, right? So one way to steal it is, well, if the passwords are transmitted over a network, and if they are transmitted in plain text, then the attacker can try to sniff on the network. They can, of course, try to look over your shoulder as you type the password. And if, let's say, like some of the password systems which either display the password as you type it in, or at least display the last letter that you just typed in, either of those methods allow an attacker that's looking over your shoulder to steal the password. This is called shoulder surfing. Somebody is sort of standing behind you and trying to figure out what your password is. If they are not doing network sniffing or shoulder surfing, then another way is to install malware on your machine. And when you try to log in, this malware can intercept the keys, and then these keys can be sent to the attacker, and now the attacker has your correct password, and now they no longer have to guess, so they can log in and then do their stuff. And I'm sure you're all familiar with phishing, right? So where the idea is that you're trying to log into a website, and the phishing website is designed to look very much like the real website. And so you get fooled, and then you type in your password into the phishing website. And now, of course, it's the attacker's website. Therefore, the attacker has seen your password, and then they can use that password to go back to the real website. Okay, so phishing is often combined with other techniques like typo squatting, where the attacker relies on the fact that you're trying to say go into your bank, and you mistyped one letter and in the name of the bank, and this the attacker already bought a domain with that misspelled name so that they can create a phishing website there and then capture your password in case you got fooled. So, so that's another technique. And then a last technique is sort of a bootstrapping technique. So the attacker can first try to steal your email password, and then they can go to, let's say, your bank, and then they can force a reset of the password. This can be done either, maybe by requesting password reset explicitly, or simply by, guessing, making a few incorrect attempts to enter the password. And usually what happens when that happens is that the system automatically resets the password. And then when the password is reset, the reset email goes to, the reset is sent via email. And so if the attacker already has your email account, then they can capture that reset email, and then they can log into your account and then set the passwords and take over your account, right? So so password reset is yet another mechanism to steal the password. So so let's look at how some of these problems can be addressed. The very first problem we'll talk about is stealing of passwords. And this can be dealt with by the trusted path concept we talked about before. So the way, so we talked about trusted path before. So the trusted path here means that the path between the communication path between the user and the system is trustworthy, right? So if some kind of spyware or keylogger is sitting on your computer, then the trusted path property is broken, right? Because some unknown, untrusted entity is able to sniff or intercept the traffic between the user and the system. Okay, so if a trusted path is can be ensured, then then the password stealing becomes more difficult. So so obviously for that to happen, you need to make sure that your system is free of malware, which is of course a challenge, not an insurmountable challenge, but something that most certainly requires some vigilance on the part of users to make sure that their systems are always up to date in terms of system patches, that you don't download and run code from unknown sites. So if you're careful, then you can generally avoid spyware and malware on your system, and then the trusted path property is somewhat easier to achieve. So so sometimes what happens is that it is not spyware that gets installed into the operating system, but it's more of a website that's able to throw a dialog box that kind of mimics your password dialog that you might see from another website that you trust, or let's say your own computer, right? So in those cases, operating systems often provide special key sequences that engage the operating system directly, so that the operating system can ensure that the password that you type in goes only to the operating system and doesn't go to some random user level process. Okay, so this way you can ensure that some spoofed dialog doesn't get your password, but your password is in fact being typed into the operating system. So this is going back to the stealing. this addresses this keylogger and other malware and phishing type of problems, but then there are other problems that still exist, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so yeah, before we go there, let's talk about phishing a little bit more, right? So phishing involves tricking a user to visit a website that looks like another website that the user trusts. Okay, so some of the early solutions were based on two-stage login. So the idea is that the first stage you will type in your user ID, and then the system will prompt you at that point with a prompt that is specific to the user, right? So so the idea is that you should type in your password only if you see your specialized prompt that is customized for you. If you don't see this, then that's an indication that perhaps you didn't go to the real website, that you might have gone to a phishing website. And here the thinking is that the attacker would not be able to figure out what is the personalized prompt that is shown to the real user. Okay. More importantly, it assumes that the user is going to really look for this personalized prompt, okay, which might be a personalized image. Unfortunately, users are not, usually not that careful. They are in a rush. They are trying to, and then they are typing in passwords almost reflexively. And as such, what happens is that they are really not paying very much attention. So this kind of phishing defense, doesn't really work that well. And so by and large, although some sites continue to use it, some sites have, started to have discontinued using this kind of two-stage logins. A better approach for phishing defense is to rely on SSL, or also called TLS. So if you have end-to-end encryption, then what happens then is that you can check whether you got, you can look at your browser will tell you whether you are logged into the real site, because it gives you clues about whether the site has provided a certificate and what the certificate is from. Okay, and so based on that, you can okay, so I am on the real website, and then you can type in the password and you'll be safe. But of course, that doesn't prevent attackers from trying various social engineering techniques. So many years ago, it used to be fairly easy for the phishing website to simply provide redirect to HTTP, right? So even though you are trying to do a HTTPS, it connects you back to HTTP, and then now the protection of SSL goes away. Alternatively, they can say, you know what, this our servers are down, SSL servers are down, and so you have to use non-encrypted connection. So various other techniques were attempted, and the browser writers, the browser vendors, decided that they are going to crack down on all these techniques, and they made it quite a bit difficult to mount these kinds of social engineering tricks anymore. So at this point, SSL, especially if you look at the lock icon and you click on it before you enter your password, then you are fairly safe against phishing type of attacks. So we have gone over these techniques already. So what I'm going to do is we still haven't talked about network-based stealing, and we'll get to that again further down in this lecture. So let's talk about some of the other password problems which are somewhat more recent, right? So in old days, people had one password to remember, and so it's the advice that are given to users was that never write it down, because if you write it down, then somebody may be able to get come across this written down password, and therefore they may be able to get your password. But over time, we have we now have dozens of passwords, if not hundreds of passwords, and clearly nobody in their right minds can remember 100 distinct passwords, especially because we are told we shouldn't use the same password on multiple sites. So how can you remember 100 passwords? So one trick that people try is, okay, let me have a basic password, and then I will create variants by adding a number or adding a particular symbol to this basic password. But once you do that, that makes dictionary attacks easy, because the attacker, if they find your one password, then they can also look at the password and guess what is the base and what is the added part that you have added. And then now they can simply vary the added digit or 2 digits that you have added to the base password. And now they can enumerate many possible passwords of yours very quickly. So, so this is clearly a problem. And so, so we need to have some way to deal with this. And in particular, we should avoid using this base plus, some digits or any other way of generating multiple passwords from the same base password. Because ultimately, the problem with lots of passwords seems to be that any password that is easy to remember maybe is also easy to guess, because the very features that make a password easy to remember could be the ones that those features may be incorporated into a password enumeration algorithm and be used to guess passwords quickly. So, so the people have, over time come up with various techniques to deal with the difficulty of remembering passwords, right? So one aspect of having to remember many passwords is that users are invariably going to forget passwords. And so techniques are developed to reset passwords. And unfortunately, these techniques can be abused, as we talked about before. Or the techniques themselves are weak. For instance, for many websites, you're asked to choose a security question, but many of these security questions are fairly easy to guess the answers. And so they are not exactly satisfactory. Fortunately, with the availability of smartphones or even just phones, most systems have switched to using, you know, using your phone as to basically send you a second, password or confirmation code. So whenever you, mistap your password or you forget your password, then the password reset information is, not sent to your email because, as we said before, the email could be hacked. The assumption is that your phone is somewhat more secure. So if the information is texted to your phone, then the password reset is going to be a little bit more, robust. So, so there are several schemes have been developed to improve this basic password scheme. So the basic password scheme being one which requires you to remember hundreds of passwords for different sites. And one way to address that is to use a password manager, which is itself protected using a master password. Okay, so this is the most viable and practical technique that is available to you today, right? So until a few years ago, people were given highly outdated information, highly outdated advice that they should not use password managers, and they should, it was outdated because, again, people cannot remember hundreds of passwords, and any attempt to do so will invariably make the passwords less secure, right? So the best approach is to use a random number generator for generating your passwords, and then use the master password to encrypt and store this random password, okay? And all of this is done conveniently by a password manager for you. Password managers are, typically built into most browsers today, or there are also third-party password managers that are available that you can use. I tend to be skeptical of many of these third-party password managers. I tend to trust the I think people who write browsers tend to be highly familiar and highly exposed to the security threats that are prevalent today. And I think these teams consist of very smart and very competent people. And so I tend to put more faith in them getting the password manager logic right, because if the password manager logic is wrong, then that becomes a single point of failure, because if an attacker can somehow crack your password manager, then they get not just one password, but all of your passwords, right? So it's really important for the password manager to be really secure. And so I tend to rely, I tend to trust my browser vendor more than many other password manager providers. But of course, this is not necessarily always the right thing. If you do enough research about a particular password manager vendor, you may gain enough faith in them, and they may end up being better choice. So the idea of master password.
So, Professor.
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to ask when the password manager or something like iCloud Keychain for Apple suggests a strong password, is it only on the basis that it is not reused anywhere else?
So I am not familiar with the particular system, and I can imagine that any system can generate a password using a random number generator, right? So again, if you go back to the cryptographic random number generators in the last lecture, you can use those types of random number generators to generate passwords. And then if the password manager remembers the password, then you don't have to worry about the fact that it is gibberish and impossible to remember. And yes, typically they would offer to generate a unique password for each site, because again, there is no shortage of random numbers, right? So you can generate thousands or millions of random numbers if you want. And so you have millions of random number generators.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So what I personally do is that on Linux, there is a device called /dev/random. Okay. So /dev/random, I can, type it here, right? /dev/random is a device. If you read from the device, then you will get a cryptographic random numbers from there. And what I do is I run a program called the base64 encoder on this. I read like 16 bytes from this device, run a base64 encoding on this, which will give me an ASCII string. And I can use that ASCII string. I cut and paste that into my browser when I'm asked for a password, and then then the browser remembers that password, and then it goes from there. Okay. So so the password managers provide a secondary benefit that people do not really think about, and that is that computers are not easily phished, right? So if you have a password for bank.com, then if you misspell the bank name, that's not going to confuse your browser, right? The browser is going to do a comparison of the real bank's domain name, and it's not going to match, and it's not going to try to supply your bank's password to some other site that has a slightly different spelling of its domain name, right? So it's not going to be phished, and it's relatively immune to keyloggers. Of course, if you have a keylogger, then the keylogger may be able to steal your master password when you type the master password. So that is certainly a problem. But at least since you're not typing your password to each website all the time, then the window of time during which some malware can steal a password is somewhat limited. And of course, the other benefits, such as being able to generate strong passwords, because again, random passwords are the strong passwords, right? Anything that makes sense to you in some way is going to be easier to guess. So it's really cryptographic random numbers that should be the basis for your passwords. But of course, you should not use password managers on shared devices, right? I mean, this is obvious. So, and the second drawback is that you can have a false sense of security if your master password itself is not secure, right? So if you haven't, so all this relies on you being able to create a really strong master password, and if that master password is really strong and and you keep it really secure, then using password managers really makes sense. Any questions on password managers? Again, if you have not been using password managers, you should use them going forward. And you should also be careful what software you install on your machine, because don't open yourself to malware, right? And if you find yourself that you need to download and install some software for some project, it's always a good idea to do it inside a virtual machine so that your base operating system is not going to be compromised. Because once your base operating system is compromised, then all bets are off, right? Your master password can be captured, anything and everything is suspect from that point on.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
On the last slide, it was written that modern browsers are very difficult to phish, and you said that if we misspell a bank's website, then it would be very difficult for them to get the password. So how does it exactly work? Because say a URL.
No, this is a very simple thing, because if they, when you go to a website, right?
Mm-hmm.
The browser is going to say, okay, what is the domain name of this website? It's going to look up in its dictionary, right?
Yeah.
It's a good look, you're doing an exact match, right? It's not doing an approximate match.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's looking up abc.com and instead you typed abcd.com, it's
Mm-hmm.
not going to look at abc.com's password, right? Its database. It's only going to look up.
But if suppose abcd.com looks exactly in UI as abc.com.
It's not looking at the UI, right? It's just looking at the domain name.
Okay, but the user doesn't always look at the domain name. So if he...
That is why the users have a problem, right? The browser is not looking at the user, the look and feel of the website, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a person, right?
Mm-hmm.
It knows the website to which it is connected, right?
Okay. So the thing is that if the user doesn't look at the domain name, then it's not, that is not guaranteed that browsers cannot be phished.
No, the user is completely out of the picture, right?
Okay.
Because the user has at some point, let's say it's ABC Bank, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go to ABC Bank, you set up your account, and when you set up your account and you check, select your username and password, mm-hmm. your browser remembers it for abcbank.com.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, you make a mistake and say abcdbank.com.
Okay.
The browser goes to connect to abcdbank.com, but when it could be a phishing website. When it comes up and asks you for a password, the browser that has never seen abcdbank.com, so it's not in its password database, so it's not going to offer any options for you to fill in. It's not going to autofill any password for you.
Okay,
so
got it.
There is
I actually misinterpreted the sentence.
Yeah.
I thought something else. I got it. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. It's good. Anyway, it's good to ask the question, because that's how some things are not clear otherwise. Okay, so let's go to the next topic, which is stealing password on the network, right? So, or let's sort of take a step back and look at how things were, say 25, 30 years ago, right? Because it's useful to understand, how these protocols came to be designed, starting from something relatively simple to something, much more sophisticated and strong that we have today. Okay, so in the very early days, when computers were networked on Unix, you had these applications for remote login called RLogin or RSH, right? So RSH and RLogin were these programs. And now the question was, how do you do the remote login? And the way it was set up was that it was assumed that when you log into a server, the server would want to do the authentication itself, which meant that you needed to type the password over the network, right? So the network, your password was typed on the network, it was transmitted on the network, and the plain text password will be picked up by the server. It will hash it and then compare it against its password database. But unfortunately, that means that your plain text password is going over the network, where it can be, somebody can sniff the password. And anybody who has a device connected to the local network can very easily sniff the password. And so this poses a problem. And so people had to come up with an alternative. And one alternative that was proposed was, hey, don't type the plain text password. Why not have the client side encrypt the password and only transmit the encrypted password on the network? But this doesn't solve any problem, because somebody can sniff the encrypted password and then they can simply retransmit the same encrypted password, and it is as good as the original password, right? So that doesn't work. So this is an instance of a more general class of attacks called replay attack, where the attacker simply observes some encrypted data and simply retransmits that encrypted data, and that gives them access to something that they shouldn't have access to. So to deal with these replay attacks, the notion of one-time passwords was developed, and we will talk about these one-time passwords now. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about challenge response protocols that are a little bit more, more modern now. So what is a one-time password? One-time password, the idea is that you can use the password once, and once it is used, it can no longer be used. Okay. So the idea is simply to make it impossible for the attacker to reuse or to replay the password, because a replayed password is completely useless, right? The first time the password is used, the server will allow you to log in. But if the attacker remembers, sniffs this password and tries to use it again later on, that password is no longer valid because it has been used. So what this means is that the user needs a list of possible passwords, and that's how they are going to so they'll have a list of passwords, and each time they will use the next password from this list, right? So the protocol goes like this, right? The system first says, hey, you have used up to I-1 passwords. So now I want the ith password. And the user then provides the ith password in the list. And then the system verifies whether it is the ith password. And then it allows the user to log in. Okay. So if you're going to have a list of passwords, then the question is, how are you going to generate this list of passwords? And there is a simple way using hash functions to generate this list of passwords. So the idea is you start with a base password and you hash it repeatedly, right? H raised to the power 1 of P, right? So so the notation here is, let me just type here, right? H1 of P is nothing but H of P, right? And read it as H superscript 2, right? H2 of P is nothing but H of P and so on, right? So H to the power n means you apply the hash function repeatedly n times. So the idea is that instead of generating n distinct passwords, the user simply applies the hash n times in order to generate the password. Okay, and this way the password cannot be repeated. And notice that P itself is never transmitted on the network. So the attacker, even if they sniff, they will not be able to find out how to, if the ith password is leaked, then the user will not be able to, the attacker will not be able to figure out what is the I+1 password. And once again, there is a problem in your assignment that will show you how this scheme works. So let us stop here. And if there are any questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we will continue from this point in the next lecture. Okay, if there are no questions, let us meet again on Monday. Okay, if you had any trouble with the class today, either in terms of the topics or in terms of audio or video or anything, please post it on the on Piazza, because if you post it on Piazza instead of sending me an email, that way others can comment, so I will know whether the problem is widespread or not. That's the only way I get feedback, and we can try to improve the process in the future. Okay, so thank you, and we'll talk again next week.